Our next session is titled The Arts and Artists, Their Reach, Their Results, Their Rewards of Action. We'll hear from both artists themselves and those who work directly with artists engaged in international cultural activity. They'll share with us their motivations and the issues they're confronting in their work and how their work reaches across borders. We've asked each to speak about 20 minutes, and hopefully we'll have time for one or two questions at the end. First up is Shahidul Alam, photographer, writer, curator, and activist. He returned to his hometown Dhaka in 1984 after getting a PhD in chemistry at London University. Former president of the Bangladesh Photographic Society, he set up the award-winning Drick Agency, the Bangladesh Photographic Institute, and Pathshala, the South Asian Institute of Photography. Director of the Chobi Mela Festival and chairman of Majority World Agency. His work has been exhibited at MoMA, the Pompidou Center, Royal Albert Hall, Museum of Contemporary Arts in Tehran. Guest curator at the National Art Gallery in Malaysia and the Brussels Biennale. His numerous photographic awards include the Mother Jones and the Andrea Frank Awards. Shahidul.
Thank you for having me. I'll stand up because I want you to look at my T-shirt. It says in Bangla, well, what it says in English. I'm a blogger. It's a T-shirt I specifically had made a couple of years back, just after a young blogger had been murdered. He'd been murdered because he was expressing his opinion, and there were people who considered that that was not acceptable. That began a series. Initially, there was a hit list of 84 people, and since then, I think if the count is right, about 16 people have been killed. Yeah? I decided to put on this T-shirt. At that time, I'd hoped that I would only wear it once, but I've had to wear it time and time again. And I say it because there are these issues we need to deal with, and I think it's not something which is unique either to the West or to the East or anywhere else specifically. It is an endemic thing that we need to consider. The reason, and he talked about my switch, the reason I became an artist is because I looked for tools that would work, and I felt I had art, specifically visual media, as a very, very powerful tool which I could use to try and address my concerns. And I'll talk very briefly about some of the work, but the title of this about the West and Muslim communities itself is one of the things we need to consider, because when one talks about Muslim communities, most Westerners currently believe that religious extremism is primarily a problem of Islam. We forget that, Sinhalese and Tamils in Sri Lanka, Buddhists and Hindus in Bhutan, Hindus and Sikhs in Punjab, Eritreans and Ethiopians in the Horn of Africa, Hutus and Tutsis. There is conflict all across the place, including within religions themselves, Catholics and Protestants, Shias and Sunnis. All of that continue, yet it's seen by that one label. And very people are able to go beyond that. One of the problems, of course, is identity. I mean, who are Muslims in the first place? It's not a homogeneous unit. If I were to cluster Americans and Philippines and Bolivians together because they're Christians, you wouldn't consider that a very natural collection as such. Yet, for Muslims, that label seems to be something that does come about very easily. Now, there are issues. Obviously, there are issues. I mean, there have been prejudice. There has been throughout history. Anti-Semitism can be found today, but I don't think it's as much a threat today as it was during the Nazi times or even in North America before World War II. Islamophobia, on the other hand, is a problem today, and I think there's no escaping from it. We need to address it. But why is it a problem, and why this specific thing? I think it has to do with a degree of exceptionalism, which I'll try and address a bit later on. But just a question for you. If I were to ask you about possibly the biggest war crime that's ever taken place, what would you identify as? What would you say it was? It's not a trick question, and there's no right answer. You can say whatever you want. I just want to get a sense of what you think. There are so many, but, the biggest, whatever, yeah? Genocide, yeah? That's certainly an important one. If genocide, for instance, and I'll pick up on that because, that has taken place, most genocides have taken place over a long period of time, over ideological beliefs, and issues people are passionate about. But if you think of single acts of violence, there probably haven't been any bigger than the 2 bombs that were exploded in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The people who died were people in their homes, doing their cooking, watching television. Well, did you have television in those days? I'm not sure. Listening to radio, let's be safe. But, going to school, having sex, whatever, who had no connection with the war whatsoever. They were killed by individuals far away who decided that had to happen to demonstrate a point. The argument that has been put forward that it was for the safety of Americans is not true. We all know that. It was done for muscle flexing, to demonstrate to the Soviets what American power was. So all these people were burnt to cinders in those brief moments. Yet they are not generally the things that surface when we talk about war crimes. They've not been challenged for war crimes. Yet they've happened. Now, I'm not saying that's the only thing, but why these shifts? And I think it is because some people control the narrative. And essentially, it is the people who control the narrative who influence how these thoughts are there. There's a very interesting African statement which goes something like, "Until the lions find their storytellers, stories about hunting will always glorify the hunter." And I'd like to take it on from that. And really, at the end of the day, it is not about religion, it is about power, it's about vested interests, and the other things are taken on because we find them convenient at any one point. The conflict in Israel and Palestine, very serious one. I am non-practicing, but, a bearded Muslim. If the tables were turned, I would have no hesitation today to be fighting for my Israeli brothers and sisters against the Palestinians. But that is not the way it is. And today, I have no hesitation in throwing stones as hard as I can for my Palestinian brothers and sisters. It's the same point. If there is oppression, if there's inequality, I know which side of the fence I'm going to stand on. And the other things are taken on arbitrarily because they're convenient excuses we find as we go along. And I think we need to look at those things. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but I do think there is one very, very core idea we need to get across. Until another's prosperity gives one joy, until another's sorrow gives one pain, until the betterment of another becomes one's concern, we will not be liberated. And our liberation can only be through another's freedom. And victory of another will always be a defeat for oneself unless that is grasped. I will show you a very short body of work. I wear several hats, and I've been working as an educationist, as a media activist, as an artist at many levels. But I'll tell you, the work that I've been doing over the last 30, 35 years has been on 2 core issues. One is migration, which now, of course, has become very big, but I've been doing it for 30 years. I've also been looking at state repression, which, again, happens across our globe. It happens internationally, it happens nationally. And when I started doing my work on extrajudicial killings, which is Crossfire, one of the issues I wanted to take up was that the Rapid Action Battalion in Bangladesh, who do the killings, have actually been given training by the United States and the UK. And I think these are things we need to consider. When we talk about democracy and freedom and all those sort of things, I think the culpability of governments needs to be taken on board. So this particular work that I'm going to show, a tiny clip, is about a woman called Kalpana Chakma, who was of indigenous origin, who was abducted by the military on the 12th of June, 1996. And, if you know the history of Bangladesh, we were born because we fought for the right to speak our own language. Our oppressors, our colonizers at that time, wanted us to speak Urdu, and we wanted to speak our own language. Having fought and become independent, we have suppressed other people's right to speak their language in my own country. And this is an issue which needs to be dealt with. So often in history, the oppressor takes on the very habits of the oppressed take on the very habits of the oppressors and replicate it. And why that happens is more complex than can be worked out at this point. But as an artist, one also needs to find the visual language to engage. Sure, I mean, this work outside I'll show you later on, but there was a very interesting statement made by a curator, Christian Cajole, and he talked about Eugene Smith, the great American photographer who did this wonderful body of work on Pittsburgh. And Christian was saying, had Smith been alive today, though this is the greatest photojournalistic work that he has ever done and considered one of the classics, he would probably have used a different visual language. And I think we need to recognize that if it is to communicate, then that language cannot be that holy grail that we've stuck onto and will not move from. We need to respond to the audience we talk to and find ways in which we do it. So here was a challenge to me as an artist of telling a story about a woman who is no longer there. And I've been doing it for several years, every year finding different ways of doing it. And this most recent work, which I'm showing you now, is a portrait of the warriors, the campaigners who have continued the struggle. And when I spoke to them, they remarked on the fact that Kalpana, in her home, had no furniture. The only things they had were these straw mats that they slept on. So there was this idea of how basic her life was, yet the question that someone who had so little was such a threat to the government that they felt the need to disappear her. So I then decided I would use these straw mats as my canvas. So then, as a photographer, I needed to find a way to create images on straw mats. There are techniques, analog techniques and other things where you can actually create emulsion. But for me, that was not enough. I had to go beyond that. And when I interviewed her brother, he talked about how Kalpana, in the last argument she had with her abductor, was arguing about the fact that the military had burned their villages. So then I decided to use fire to produce the images. So I had my canvas, I had my tool. I needed now to find a way in which I could use fire to create images on straw. But I wasn't content with that alone, and we are working on a campaign called No More, which we've been doing for some time, which includes, amongst other things, the garment industry disasters that took place in Bangladesh. And I don't see anyone here with jeans, or torn jeans anyway, but you know what I'm talking about. You see all these torn jeans. You've got one? But okay, well, we'll work on that. Yeah. Okay. But these tears are very specific tears. They're designer tears. They don't happen randomly. And you have a buyer somewhere in Europe or North America designing a specific tear, and that design is sent to a factory in Bangladesh. They use a laser beam to burn the jeans specifically on the basis of that design. It's then washed, and it miraculously tears in a random fashion. Yeah? But so then I decided I would use that laser beam to create my images. So then it required a fair amount of reverse engineering to see how I could use this laser beam to burn using my photographs onto the straw mat. And I'm going to show you how that's done. But we didn't stop there. So in the gallery itself, and that will be shown next week in Malta, the Commonwealth Global Forum, we have, it's a completely dark room, and you will see it there, so I'm not going to describe it in great detail. But for me, what was very, very effective and reinforcing was the fact that it had an effect on the audience, which I myself had not anticipated. People were in tears, they were moved, and it created a space that we've never been able to create before. My show, An Extrajudicial Killings in 2010, was closed down by the government. The show the previous year was closed down by the government. But then we strategized and we worked out what we needed to do. And the last three shows, which are by far the most critical, and they're critical of an entity that in Bangladesh is completely taboo, the military. You may question many other things, including the Prime Minister. You do not question the military. Yet, in our own space, in our own gallery, we were able to show work where indigenous people came and felt they could talk about the military and repression. And we were allowed to go on. And I think we need to create those spaces. So let me show you this. I don't think we have a lot of time, so if there is time afterwards, I'll spend on that. Could we have those lights down, please? And tell me if the audio is there. So that's the laser beam actually burning the straw as this image is being produced. And in the gallery itself, you have the straw, the smell of the straw, and it's a dark space within which the people come in. This is the only image we have of Kalpana. Well, one of a few. Could we have the audio up? And these are images, these are settlers who've occupied their land. So people come into the gallery. It's a dark space, so when they walk in, it's completely dark. And then one by one, the candles are lit, and that's how you light the prints. So I'm actually talking about the rationale.
সেগুলি আমাদের জানার বোঝার দরকার এবং একজন একা কত বড় একটা ভূমিকা রাখতে পারে সেটা থেকে আমরা অনুপ্রেরণা পেতে চেষ্টা করি এটা আমাদের জন্য না এটা কল্পনা চাকমার জন্য আমাদের সেই বোনকে আমরা আবার খুঁজে পেতে চাই এবং সেই দাবি আমি করছি
And now she's reading out in native language a very powerful poem written by another activist, which we then translated into Bangla in English. And at the end, the audience makes a pledge.
Abandon, neglect, rage, a throbbing womb, my stage. I curl, I tear asunder, awake. I search, I wander. I am who I am, and I will persist. I shall defy. রুখে দাঁড়াবো না কেন রুখে দাঁড়াবো না কেন রুখে দাঁড়াবো না কেন রুখে দাঁড়াবো না কেন I will resist I shall defy I will resist I shall defy
And then there is another section to the exhibition which are more conventional prints, and that talks about the narrative, that gives the background and helps set the context. And that essentially is how this exhibition is done. And each show we've done, we've tried to look at ways in which we can engage with the public. So the artwork is not sufficient in itself. It's that engagement, the curatorial practice. So this is an image of the Kaptai Lake, and it's the formation of the lake which led to the displacement and the submersion of the tropical forests and things like that. I think that's enough. I don't think we need to go any further than that. And I'll just end with something about the Crossfire Exhibition that we did, which is on extrajudicial killings. We knew they were going to close us down, or they would attempt to do so. So we prepared for it. Firstly, we had, the whole thing was being live streamed. We were going to do an interview, a Skype interview with Alain Julia, the Director General of Reporters Sans Frontières. So while the police, armed police, is around the gallery closing it down, I'm actually doing a gallery walk inside on Skype, being filmed and live streamed at the same time. The government doesn't have a clue. They didn't know what the hell they could do. They had closed down our gallery because they said we needed permission. We'd done our homework. We got the best lawyers. We worked out they didn't have a legal basis to close the show down. So we took them to court. And this was a very interesting thing because in our countries, technically there is the separation with the judiciary and the executive, but in practice, courts tend to go the way the politicians want them to do. But here, there was such a massive public support for our work that the courts felt empowered and ruled against the government. So we had the show for one day. And of course, the floodgates opened, everyone came. But that wasn't enough. We knew that the foreign minister was going to come to open the next show. So we lined up the corridor with those prints, and she had to walk through those prints, smiling at the media, gritting at me and smiling at me while she went through. But, and we've found all those ways at every stage. And what is very interesting is that after having closed those two shows down, they've discovered that we're better off left alone. I'm sure there is a point when we'll find out how far is too far, but for the moment, it's okay. And it's not always easy to gauge where that point is. And in 1996, after a protest that we did, I was stopped in the streets and 8 knives put into me. But I haven't been knifed since 96, so we're doing okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shahidul, and especially for sharing that moving video.